I'll just turn it over to my fellow panelists here to introduce themselves after I give myself a brief introduction. I'm Laurent Carbonneau. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators. If you're here today, you probably know that. And hopefully you've been reading our Mooseworks newsletter that we've been working on kind of for the last year now, give or take, which has been a lot of fun. And it's been great to kind of connect with a broader audience than, what CCI as a business council perhaps often does. So it's been great to sort of join the broader general policy conversation. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado now, I'll turn it over to Vass to introduce herself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Vass Bednar. Most of the time, I run McMaster University's MPP in Digital Society program. I also host the Globe and Mail's newish podcast called Lately. I write a monthly column for the report on business there. And I spend, I guess, a lot of time typing and thinking through things like Regs to Riches and other projects. I'm very happy, very honored, and have no business being in the same virtual stage or even the same, room or floor as Mr. Brett House. So, I'm looking forward to muddling through together and hopefully putting some useful stuff forward. Laurent, I feel like should have said the same for you, but I'm really like,
Oh, no, no, no.
but
I
he's
think
a Brett House. You know what I mean? He's a Brett House. That's your intro, Brett.
I mean, that's always my intro.
I
I
know.
don't know if I'm mighty and letting it all hang out, but we'll stop the metaphor there. My name is Brett House. My pronouns are he, him. I am a professor of economics at Columbia Business School in New York, but a Canadian based out of Toronto, where I am also a fellow with the Public Policy Forum, Monk School, and Massey College at the University of Toronto. My research as an academic and policymaker in the past, and erstwhile Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank, was focused in part on productivity and economic growth and what we can do to raise both of those big factors in advancing national well-being, both in Canada and other countries around the world, and mopping up from financial crises when they happen, preventing them, and figuring out how to handle bankruptcies when they occur at a national scale. So the ideas we're discussing today in a specifically Canadian context are really near and dear to my interests across my entire career. And I'm really grateful to CCI for convening this conversation, for a multiplicity of conversations around growth and innovation, facilitating the Innovation Governance Program, which I was pleased to participate in, and to doing so across Canada on the traditional territories of a variety of peoples. And today I am coming to you from the traditional lands of the Lenape in New York. And with all of you, I invite us to reflect on the stewards of the land we're on and how we can be better stewards with them.
Thanks to you both. And also I've noticed some folks have popped in. So if you feel like you've got FOMO about like, oh, did I miss something really spicy in the first 2 minutes? Don't worry, you will get all of it later. We're recording and we'll make this available. So no worries on that score. So I'll set the stage a little bit here. So, productivity, competitiveness, and of course, innovation, all of this stuff has been very top of mind, I think, from national sort of policy conversations for the last couple of years. And I think we've seen a certain raising of the temperature of that conversation and perhaps a breaking of glass, as it were, as the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada so memorably put it about a month or so now, about, how are we going to, in a world where the growth in productivity is slowing down in Canada, how are we going to be a place where we remain a prosperous country where we're able to offer, ourselves and our kids and their kids, the sort of Canadian dream that we've kind of all gotten to enjoy. So with that in mind, CCI comes at this from the angle of how can innovation contribute, but it's not the entire conversation. We wanted to sort of have today a bit of a broader conversation about how innovation, productivity, and all these other aspects, including competition sort of internally within Canada, kind of all ties into this broader question of prosperity, which I think is really at the heart of what we care about at CCI, and I think what is at really the center of all of these policy debates. So, Brett, I wanted to turn it over to you first to talk a little bit just at a high level. What is the Canadian productivity story right now, and kind of what's your read on how things are going there?
Well, thanks. And in doing so, I'm going to set the Canadian productivity story into the broader context of the global productivity story and the history of that story over the last 40 or 50 years and the last 300 years or so, because much of this discussion happens in a very short term horizon, when in fact, productivity is something we deal with generally as economists over much longer spans of time. Little wiggles from one quarter to the next are generally measurement errors in what is a very theory and model dependent measure of how we're doing, how smartly we're working. And so I do want to give just a little perspective and then dig into some of the current discussion. So, productivity is most essentially about working smarter, not working harder, doing more with the same amount of capital and labor inputs or fewer inputs on both fronts, developing better recipes, plans, technologies for how we put capital and labor together and getting better outputs and more outputs as a result. That has been the key thing that has driven economic growth for the last 300 years. And economic growth is really a phenomenon of only about the last 3 centuries. If you look at the GDP of the entire world, it is a very flat graph that becomes a vertical hockey stick somewhere in the 1700s. So the incredible improvement in human well-being over the last 300 years has been totally and almost fundamentally and completely driven by productivity and innovation gains. And there were three big waves in those gains. And again, I'm charting all this out to give us a big context and also for the founders, the operators, the investors in this call to give you a sense of how pointy-headed economists like myself are thinking about this in a broader way and why some of the things we say or note might land in your ears in a strange way, but they get launched because they are in this bigger context. We've had three really big waves of productivity gains and innovations. One, unsurprisingly, was the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. The second was around the World Wars with greater use of chemicals, electrification, and automation. And then third in the 70s and 80s into the 90s with the rise of computers and digitalization. And, in fact, it's not just in Canada, but almost everywhere since the 90s, productivity growth has been slowing. So this is not an endemic problem just to Canada. But the real concern here is that Canada has been slowing more quickly than other places in the world. So growth is slower everywhere in productivity terms, but Canada is slower in terms of its productivity progress than other countries. The big question now is, will AI or other big innovations coming out of the companies represented in this audience be the fourth big wave of productivity gains and innovation that will improve those productivity growth numbers, not just in Canada, but globally? And the jury's very much out on that. And it's not going to be easy to tell initially or over the next few years even, because we've got some confounding factors going on. First off, whenever we have a big wave of innovations, the effect on productivity is often negative before it is positive in the big numbers. And we call that a J-curve effect in economics, where we initially put a lot of money into something, we have to figure out how to use it. The corollary would be personal computers in the 80s and 90s. We got a lot of them, we spent a ton on them. They actually didn't do anything to productivity until into the later 90s and into the early 2000s. AI is probably going to be similar. It's going to cost us a lot, and the productivity gains on an economy-wide basis won't be immediate. At the same time, we've got demand on capital from climate investments. We've got aging populations who are also going to be drawing down capital and making it harder for firms on average to find investable funds. And we've got frictions from trade in peril between the United States and China and the changes in supply chains that are making them more costly. So all of that is in the background, but focusing more clearly on the last little while in Canada, Carolyn Rogers sounded the alarm, noting to much citation the fact that in 1984, Canada's productivity was about 88% of the United States. It's now in the range of about 71% of the United States. We've done worse than all other G7 countries against the US, save Italy. And more recently, Trevor Tome at the University of Calgary and others in my tribe have pointed out that productivity particularly slowed in Canada from 2015 on as investment in the oil and gas industry dried up, as we faced huge trade uncertainty with the United States in the renegotiation of NAFTA, as we saw housing become more expensive and limiting labor mobility, as we saw a big increase over the last 8 years in public sector employment, which has tended to focus in areas of the economy that have very low productivity growth. And more broadly, as we've seen the Canadian economy focus not just in the public sector, but more generally on areas like construction, infrastructure, health, education, services, accommodation, food, all areas where productivity growth is traditionally very slow. So we have some particular challenges in Canada, challenges in some cases that are accidental, some that we've made for ourselves. But in the context of a world where productivity has slowed, but we've slowed even more.
Thanks, Brett. And I'll just remind folks as well, if you've got questions at any point, feel free to throw them into the chat and we'll kind of deal with them on the back end. So if there's stuff in there that piques your interest and you want to hear more about, don't hesitate to let us all know. And Vass, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the sort of, I know you work a lot on competition issues among others, but if you want to talk a little bit about what you see as kind of these broad challenges in the economy and in sort of our political economic challenges and how we could sort of start to think about those.
Sure, I'll do my very, very best. I mean, I wonder if we're getting a partial credit at Columbia because I really appreciated your overview in that context and stretching, Brand. That's what I was going to put in the chat. Like, does this count? Yeah, sorry for being a jokester. I appreciate that we were able to sort of put Canada's sloth into that global context and also into history. And I wonder as we kind of draw some of those connections across productivity to things like our country's competitive intensity, we can maybe start to see some of the reasons why Canada's context ends up being somewhat unique or some of kind of the facets there. When the Bank of Canada was sort of sounding that alarm or saying break the glass, right? This like very urgent language. Something else I've been watching from the Bank of Canada has been their messaging around these three words: corporate pricing behavior. And I had to text a bunch of my smart friends to sort of understand like what were they hearing from this. And at first, what the banks seemed to be putting forward was, okay, economics 101, right? We have an expectation that as the price of inputs start to come down, pricing for products and services will also come down. But that's not the trend that they were seeing. We've seen more research in Canada around inflation and growth of margins during the pandemic. So the worst thing I think I can do on this panel is become predictable. But I worry now that I will be predictable when I sort of put forward, let's also contextualize or kind of build more connective tissue in this conversation with the realities that we're seeing. At the same time, there's not enough research on competition in different sectors and things like that in Canada, but a report from last year where the Competition Bureau kind of buddied up with Statistics Canada, I don't think you can do any better than that. We found we found as Canadians, I was not a part of the study, Canada's most concentrated industries have become less efficient. They've increased pricing markups as the number of rivals in their markets has declined. And since 2000, market leaders have consolidated their positions at the top of their industries with the number of new entrants declining, right? We want to see what are our kind of, if you were building a dashboard of kind of competitiveness in Canada, what would we want to see every year, right? We'd be looking at things like IPOs and venture capital flows and number of new businesses started, and sort of on all of those kind of traditional metrics of dynamism, we have seen decline. So are Canadian firms just not motivated enough? We know, I'll wrap up in a second, but it's like right now I'm going to that sort of cheat sheet and I worry that these are tropes that everyone's sort of heard before, but we know that our firms historically underinvest in R&D. We know that our firms historically underinvest in their people, and we know that our firms underinvest in productivity enhancing technology that can bring those gains that Brett was speaking to. The question is why that occurs, and the answers range based on sort of, there are different kind of theories and approaches to that. So to conclude, as kind of an opener, I'd love for us to do a better job not having a productivity conversation that is in total isolation from some of these other realities.
Yeah, and I think that that point about kind of the broader, industrial institutional structure in Canada, I think is kind of
Mm.
inescapable. And, at CCI, I think a thing we've been thinking about in the last year or two quite a bit is the notion of, now that it's become something you can say again, industrial policy to some extent. And I think, a lot of reasons why people stopped talking about it kind of after the 70s and 80s. But it is a piece where in a sort of post-CHIPS Act, post-IRA world, and certainly in a world where you've seen South Korea's GDP go from, very close to Nigeria's at the time in the 60s to I think they're going to overtake Great Britain in the next couple of years on GDP per capita. So this is a really impressive thing, and it didn't happen by accident. And I think you're sort of seeing a lot of governments in the sort of more uncertain world post-pandemic and sort of the sort of, geopolitical context think a lot about this. And I'm not sure if we're there yet in Canada. We have a history of trying various industrial policies, kind of from the beginning of Confederation when we built the CPR, put up the tariff walls for the national policy, and I think we can maybe debate the impacts those had. But in thinking about, if the glass has been broken and we're reaching for the fire extinguisher, what are we trying to do kind of in the next couple of years at the policy level that could sort of address, these challenges in a way that isn't just hoping that the market is going to solve it? Because I think we've perhaps seen the limitations of that from the 80s, maybe through the 2010s. So what's kind of the playbook for the kind of next generation for the economic now and the next 15 years or so? And either of you can start with that one.
I was like, Brett was nodding. Brett, you should go first.
Well, yeah, that's that meaningful nod I hope my students are
The
giving back
listener
to me when
nod.
I'm in a
Yeah, yeah,
when
yeah.
I'm in a lecture
I
hall.
did the freeze, which was if I freeze, they'll call on someone else. No, but I will answer too.
Well, I think prior to the glass being broken, we've talked about the alarm. We've talked about the glass for 20 or 30 years. I can't think of a time when productivity in my adult life hasn't been part of the national conversation in Canada. The question is, why are we so incapable, it seems, of advancing on what have been many pieces of low-hanging fruit for a very long time, so much so that they have become almost cliches in discussion of productivity in Canada. And I think we have to admit that along the lines of insanity being defined by doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome, we have a massive institutional failure in Canada. Whatever it is between the levels of government that we have, business organizations, professional associations, universities, and other institutions that is meant to come together to create an ecosystem around productivity advances, it isn't working. Or it isn't working as it should, or it's working relatively poorly compared to other countries. And so I do think it is time for the revival of something like the Economic Council of Canada that was eliminated, about 30 years ago, whether it's focused entirely and only on productivity investment or on related issues. I'm a little more agnostic, but it should be laser focused on a narrow set of things that ensures it's not repeating what other government institutions are already doing. It should be charged with bringing all those stakeholders together. And it should be tasked with maintaining continuity between governments, between fashions, between eras. Places like South Korea, which truly are inspiring, because if we looked at South Korea at the end of the Korean War, no one would have bet on it doing better than North Korea. It had no resources. It was mainly agrarian. Almost all the manufacturing in the Korean Peninsula was toward the north. South Korea had been flattened by the war to a greater extent than North Korea. Of course, we know It's now 25 times per capita richer than the North and many other developing countries it was behind in the 1960s. And figuring out exactly what the combination of things that led to that performance is and the extent to which they're replicable is, I think, one of the most interesting questions anyone can ask, particularly an economist can ask. Uh, I have a laundry list of policy ideas we could go through that have been talked about for a long time. I have a particular take on how we might advance on them. But before we get into that, I want to flip things back over to Vass for some broader scene setting on your question, and then we can move into some of the details.
Sure, let's do it. I mean, I'd also love to understand from you the council, right? This comes up, and it's on the one hand, it feels like it gives me a bit of like a Power Rangers bat signal vibe. Like if we just had this advisory council that was more empowered, we would have better outcomes. So I want to better understand like what's preventing us not from just striking that council, but is it that we're too guarded in terms of the expertise that we take, right? Is there like what is the political barrier to achieving that in Canada, given that we've done it before? And how do we kind of remove that? I'm very interested in sort of probing that with you. Again, for me, in terms of what some of the playbook would be, are these, this reality that some sectors and some Canadian firms just don't actually have to care about this type of productive growth because there's kind of the illusion. I think Kaylee Thiessen said this, and I'm like so stealing it from her, but she said sort of confusing profit for productivity, right? In terms of how we see again the strategies and tactics of firms kind of creating those illusions of competition. And you said, Laurent, okay, we've sort of seen maybe there is a consensus that we're not going to leave the market up to itself. Well, often, you know, what we've seen is that many markets that may not have a form of government regulation, they're actually highly regulated. They're regulated by de facto private actors who have set the rules and the norms often in their favor. So I find it's often kind of important to bring that forward too, lest we sort of present a false binary of regulated or unregulated markets, that markets are just kind of regulated with those different instruments. But Brett, maybe we could talk about like, yeah, this council, like why, like, can we just make the council? Can we keep publishing for the council? But like, again, it wouldn't be as legitimate in the form of government. But what is it about government decision making that prevents us from either being able to receive that kind of thinking or conduct that kind of thinking in house? In
Yeah, I
Brett
think
House.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always in the house. The and commentary on housing, of course, is close to
Of
heart
course.
later on in our discussion.
Yes.
Um, I think it requires a government and a political class and pressure from all of us uh, to create an institution that is at arm's length, that is going to report on a narrow and data and time-bound remit on a
Mm,
consistent basis year to year, and is going to say things that will be inconvenient and that government won't want to hear.
mm,
And business won't want to hear because this is not all a defect or a problem of government. All of us have a hand in this. And I do want to set for context, many other countries have things like this in
mhm,
different forms. Canada had something like this once. It was eliminated in a combination of cost cutting and probably a fatigue with truth being represented to power. If
mm,
we are serious about the glass being broken, then collectively we need to demand that we get back to a situation where, much like the Bank of Canada, which is a democratically accountable institution, but whose remit and mandate is set on a 5-year basis, and then government and its elected representatives have no say in how it conducts that mandate. It is still accountable, but the day-to-day operations are separated from politics. That is how something like an economic council or a productivity review panel really should be constituted. A broad mandate and then a guaranteed budget for 5 years, and everyone stays out. And it has a decent representation of folks from public, private, and academic sectors,
mhm,
and some international members too, who bring a perspective outside Canada. Because again, productivity is slowing everywhere, And the
Right.
competition issues you highlight so consistently and nicely, are features of even very large economies like the US. If you look at the 20 biggest sectors in the US, the share of revenue accounted for by the four largest firms in each of those sectors has gone up consistently and
Yeah.
not insubstantially over the last 30 years.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Can I just ask you something on the years thing too, Laurent? I'm not trying to take over your panel, but you can answer too if you want, just because I have a follow-up. You were, sorry, it was in my notes from when you were kind of making some opening remarks on like time horizons, right? And productivity. Like, is there also an element with our policy making, to your mind, where we're impatient, right? And as you know, you're right. We've been gesturing and watching productivity for quite some time. Now there's more a stronger sense of urgency around it. We sort of all agree on that. Can we be patient enough to sort of experiment with policies, both corporate and public, to sort of see the shifts that we want? Or is there also a risk that in our kind of, I don't want to use the word desperation. I often say we're like desperado for productivity, but in that kind of
Mhm.
thirst for more productivity, that we will be too, is it about kind of spreading some of our bets, right? Or really
Yeah.
doubling down on what we think are the best ones?
Well, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can have a
Speak for
consistent
yourself. Yeah.
patience.
Okay.
I,
Okay.
my partner often notes that he thinks my head was previously owned by someone else, given how many times I bump into things with it. So,
Okay.
I'm not going to make any great claims on coordination here, but, uh, taking the collective capacities of Canadians, I think we can have something like an economic council that is consistently providing a drip and a reminder of the key things we need to do over long periods.
Mm-hmm.
And then on some of those things I mentioned, I think are cliches of the productivity discussion.
Yeah.
We ought to be able to exercise a bit more urgency on those, because those are the things that are the easy things to do. There are other things that are much harder and that rely on all the people in this audience, in the Zoom room, actually going out and creating innovation to do to advance our economy. But, things like cutting interprovincial trade barriers, the greatest cliche of the
Oh
Canadian
my God.
productivity
Every
discussion.
time somebody says that,
Every
someone
time.
loses, I lose my wings, guys, somewhere. No,
Andrew
could
Cohen
we,
gets his.
no,
Yeah,
could we,
well,
could
and
we
let's
put a pin
stop
on the
that.
barriers? No, let's stop
Yeah.
it. Could we talk about that one too? Because, and I'm sorry, because you and I have touched on this a little bit, but
Mhm.
you're right. We have these kind of zombie policy ideas.
Total
Doesn't
zombie policy ideas.
doesn't mean they should be totally dead in the water, but that they haven't gone anywhere. They haven't gone anywhere fast enough. We've been gesturing at them, and we sort of double down. I don't want to suggest interprovincial trade barriers is a red herring. What is stopping us from kind of confronting these like weird, not just unique histories in terms of, we don't quite have the decision memos anymore. And when we erected these, or when we agreed to these, I don't think in history anyone was sort of nefariously, in a secret lair with their kitten being like, if you want to trade this, you're going to have to do this. There was a rationale kind of at the time, but we've lost a sense of it, right? But we're kind of upholding this. Is it again, does it come down to power, not corporate power directly, but stakeholder power, kind of the
Yeah.
kind of voices we've elevated in policymaking? Like, is it diffuse leadership where it's like there's who's going to be that interprovincial czar? But I'd love to get on a panel with someone in, like, I don't know, 5 years, or 5 minutes would be better, but like 5 years, and be like, okay, look, this is what Canada did. We finally did it, and here's
Yeah.
how. So like, what's the how? Why haven't we done it?
Yeah,
And
and the
some
how
people
is the
have done it.
politics, as you've noted. The how is, or the barrier is getting the politics right. So on
Mm,
something like interprovincial trade barriers, we know from economic models and theory that the gains from dropping trade barriers accrue to yourself when you drop them, not when you force your trading
right.
partner to bring tariffs or barriers down. Alberta understood that, and a few years ago dropped almost all of its interprovincial trade barriers and then invited the rest of the provinces to come along. We need to collectively push them to do so. It is
Hmm.
in their self-interest. The other thing we can do is essentially pay them to do so. And you are seeing versions of this
Mm,
now in the type of federalism the Trudeau government is exercising, where they
yeah.
are buying policy change from the federal, or excuse me, from the provincial, territorial, and municipal governments.
Yeah.
That is rubbing some people the wrong way. But in the spirit of doing things differently in the face of decades of political barriers, I think it's a wholly acceptable approach. For instance, on interprovincial trade barriers, the International Monetary Fund, my old shop estimates that bringing them down would add 4% to Canadian GDP per year. At 2.1 trillion US dollars in GDP, that would give us $80 billion extra per year. If you tax that as a federal government at 25%, you can use that as a fund of $20 billion every year to sprinkle to the provinces to keep those tariff barriers down, to bring those, restrictive trade practices down, and to keep them down. It's exactly the kind of thing they're doing on housing, and you can replicate that. Same thing with the affordable childcare plan. That is a growth policy and a productivity policy because,
Hmm.
again, it's estimated that adds 4% to GDP. And then, just like trade barriers, that compounds every year. And that 4% of GDP at $80 billion, again, either provides you, about $20 billion in tax revenue that you can either put back into the innovation economy or keep using to incentivize greater investments in bringing up women's labor market participation.
Hmm.
And we know Quebec is the only place in North America, because of its subsidized daycare program, that has seen a shrinking in that male female labor participation gap.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
is the biggest resource we could possibly tap in our country. And then the third piece is getting our immigration system back on track. We have
Yeah.
seen just an explosion in low skilled temporary worker visas. We have seen a total undermining of the economic class of immigration that Canada has been vaunted for with our point system for decades. And it's worth remembering that's been at the behest of business. It's been at the behest
Hmm.
of hotel owners, fast food operators, meatpacking operators who said we need more labor. And the federal government has complied, and in doing so, created, the housing crisis that we're in many respects, by bringing in so many people, but people without, the skills that are going to keep productivity improving. And they brought in people in areas that have low productivity growth to begin with. Do those three things, and you're already making a huge advance. And that doesn't say anything about clusters, about innovation, or about the sort of techie things that we normally think about around productivity at all. That's a whole other additional conversation to add on.
Hmm.
So,
Maybe, yeah, Laurent,
Vass,
you
before
go.
we get
Yeah.
too far into it, I just want to
Sorry.
jump in because I just want to get a couple of the questions from folks watching in while we have a
Mm.
chance.
Absolutely.
Um, and I'll actually throw right back to you, Vass, because we have a
Uh-oh.
question about the role of regulatory capture as a root cause of some of these problems when we talk about institutional failure, lagging competitiveness. So I know this has been kind of an area of interest for you. So if you want to maybe take that and
Mm.
talk about what that means to you and how you think we can kind of
Sure,
address it.
I'll do my best. I mean, I've some people have been doing some research on kind of revolving door or trying to understand that relationship between uh, regulators, decision makers, and the private sector. There's a book from Laurent Press that features a chapter that Jennifer Quaid wrote, but now I'm blanking on the name of the gentleman who wrote it. Believe he used to run the Broadband Institute. Anyway, that's like a great compendium overview of different kind of areas where we've seen uh, not more concentration, but a kind of depreciation of the standards and the regulatory environment that have led to kind of more danger. That's sort of what it looks at. I would say, the capture, there's like an element of our maybe imagination, right? Like even framing the interprovincial trade barriers, they exist, but how do we come to understand them? Are they a failure of government because they are sort of legislated, perpetuated, and upheld by government, or are they a failure? Are they an expression of market power, of stakeholder power, where certain stakeholders can erect or collude to erect tolls, right? Barriers that they can extract additional revenue from, right? Like how we there's how we can collectively diagnose these problems to agree why they're problematic you're like, do not write that down. We're never talking to Vass again. Why we agree a problem is problematic, I do think is important. In terms of, I think capture has been part of Canada's competition story for a little bit, but also because we created a system that's highly, it's starting to shift, but highly econometric, right? Very exclusive in terms of who participated in those conversations, really confined to lawyers and economists, both know both professions that are fascinating and important, but didn't lend itself to kind of the more democratic elements of policymaking that we've come to expect, and we haven't quite seen competition law evolve in the way that our values have. So I will wrap by saying, look, Canada, we'd love to look elsewhere. We're very, we're all about the policy diffusion and importing, and a jurisdictional scan is an important part of anyone's toolkit. But I also think we need the courage to kind of put forward those kind of bespoke or, coming off the Met Gala, more couture policy interventions that appropriately reflect our uniqueness and our challenges. And sometimes that does have to do with, confronting such realities as our regionality, right? A lot of the policy interventions we bring forward tend to be, anyway, they're not sensitive to as sensitive to geographic realities as I think they could be. I don't know if that's actually as spicy a thought as I think it is, but I will turn it back to you.
Brett, we've got another question I think you might be well suited to take here, which is how does the tax system kind of interact with the productivity issue? And, obviously
Mm.
tax stuff has been pretty top of mind here at CCI for the last month or so, and especially how its interplay with innovation and the incentives to pursue innovation. So I'm happy to kind of let you discuss that a little bit and what you think might be some of the places where these spheres interact.
Well, it's a really timely question, and I think it's a nice pivot from the discussion of things like trade barriers, childcare, and immigration, which are kind of
Mhm.
context or scene setting for innovation, or related or kind of complementary things we can do, and then focusing a little more closely on what can we do to create a better space directly for investment and investment, particularly in innovation. And there, I would spare a bit of empathy for the policymakers. In the first Trudeau government, we did see under Minister Morneau a reduction in corporate taxes. We saw, a rise in the number of different subsidy and support programs, and we saw accelerated expensing on the depreciation of investments, all of which were in part to meet the tax cuts that came in under the Trump administration and to address, this longstanding concern that we weren't getting enough investment from business to actually produce the kind of innovation and productivity gains we need. The further subsidization of different business activities that we're seeing in the electrical vehicle industry, I don't think is going to end well. We are not
Mm.
capable of subsidizing on the scale of China and the US, and yet, we're acting like we can do the IRA or CHIPS Act, and we can't. And I think at this stage, it is reasonable for policymakers to ask business, what profoundly can they do to increase business investment here in Canada? Because we actually fired a number of the arrows that we had in our policy quiver over the last 8 years, even as productivity gains have slowed. And we haven't seen much bang for our buck in terms of increased investment or productivity. So the idea breadbox is a little empty at the moment, and it reflects as well a situation where we don't have a kind of clean experiment. We did all those tax and subsidy changes, but it was in the midst of oil and gas having a major decline. It was in the midst of trade uncertainty over NAFTA, and in the midst of supply chains being reconfigured through the pandemic, and in the midst of the U.S.-China trade war. So those are all breaks on investment too. It doesn't mean the things we did were wrong, but it clearly means they weren't enough to counteract whatever drag came from those. Those are the big things, I guess, I'm thinking about there, and it's really a call to business to articulate, a clear policy agenda that they would like to see come forward. Because I think there are open ears, and there's a bit of I think, a quandary in policy circles, having done those things and not having seen much of a result, what the next move should be. I would take a small pause to talk about the housing sector, which I know I saw come up in
Mhm.
I was going
a
to tee you up,
question,
so this is perfect. Go right ahead.
and the capital gains inclusion rate change. On housing, I think policy has been at the macro level completely backwards. We
Mhm.
have a housing deficit, which is massive and is widened over multiple years. We know we need more investment in housing, and yet the share of GDP, our national output and income, that is already in residential investment in real estate is too high compared with most other countries. And construction and real estate is a very low productivity sector. So we've got a paradox where to resolve our housing crisis, we need to get more money into construction and residential investment and real estate. And yet we're already putting far too much in that sector, which is low productivity growth, if we want to try to increase innovation and productivity in our economy. The only way from a top-down macro perspective, and that's what I do, is to increase capital inflows from the rest of the world, to get foreign investors to finance the development we need to get more houses built and get out of our housing crisis. Unfortunately, federal and provincial policy has gone in exactly the opposite direction, putting taxes on foreign investors, putting limits on foreigners coming in and buying real estate. I have no hair to light on fire, so I feel slightly immune to saying in the front of what will be a huge blowback from many sectors, we need more financialization in real estate, not less. We need to
Mm.
make sure that it's foreign capital that's financing our way out of our crisis. Otherwise, we're going to be dragging capital out of the innovation economy and into the very slow productivity economy of construction, real estate, infrastructure, and housing. And we are going to be having this conversation again in 10 years. So we've got to reduce those limits on capital inflows and eliminate them. They are counter to the entire history of Canada as an economic entity. We are a small people who cannot generate enough capital to finance our development domestically. We have run trade deficits and capital surpluses with the rest of the world for most of our history. And we need to go back to understanding that and understanding that we need foreign capital to get us out of the housing crisis. So we don't use up all the local capital that should be financing the firms on this call to innovate our way out of our productivity problem in the rest of the economy. And the capital gains inclusion rate change at the margin doesn't help. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around it. It's been justified on the notion of intergenerational fairness and greater equity. I think that's bunk. A really intergenerationally fair budget would have restored the Harper government's attempt to push the retirement age on federal pension payments back to 67 and put maybe another point back on the GST HST because we know taxing consumption rather than taxing investment
Mhm.
is how we incentivize growth. And this tax change, if anything, is going to put an incentive to put more money into principal residences, which remain one of the things
Yep.
that is free of taxable capital gains, and distort the economy in the wrong direction even further. So I think there are some own goals we're scoring right now that need to be undone, and we need business to help us figure out what are the additional things that we can do that would really support investment in the short and longer run.
Yeah. Vass, do you want to get a last word in before I wrap us up? And I see lots of
No.
questions, and I frankly, not to jump on my own conclusion too fast, I think we could have probably talked for quite a while longer, and this 45 minutes has gone by extremely fast. So I wish we had a little more time to get to some of these questions, but I also want to be respectful of everyone's time. So Vass, I'll let you kind of get a bit of a last word in,
Oh
and
my
then
God.
I'll close this out.
Yeah, no, I was just saying no because I can't believe the time has gone and there's more I want to hear from Brett. I mean, Brett, this Your diagnosis of our problems and how, who or what has been demonized or kind of misdiagnosed as being problematic, I do think is actually very powerful to sort of hear and package together. And you know, when they are your own thoughts, I think it sometimes feels like it could be obvious or kind of everyone has this in their back pocket. And I sort of want to make sure I'm emphasizing to you, kind of we don't. And I think these shifts in kind of where the window is of possibility and what we're actually trying to solve for is maybe one of the more critical aspects that we're talking about here as we link up productivity, innovation, and competition. And another element I really appreciated that we, could have spoken more about, again, is that connective tissue across kind of other levers, across other policy sectors. So, I'm not making like a great joke or, have something that's like super, super tweetable in my roundup, but maybe the last thing I'll sort of advocate for is for, again, that courage for Canada to really take on that challenge and thrill of being policy designers, and moving away from our over reliance, I think, on replication from other sectors. And let's maybe learn a little bit more from, what Alberta has done recently and try to copy that in the spirit of our copycatness.
Yeah, from my point of view, I think I would have maybe we'll do this another time because I think one piece
Sequels,
that
yes.
I find we're always missing in these conversations is, I went on a deep dive in sort of the history of Canadian economic policy in the last year. And
Oh
the
my
thing I
God.
came to was like it almost doesn't matter what it is that we think we're doing, as long as the institutions that are trying to put these things in place aren't fit for purpose for a variety of reasons,
Mm,
we're never going to solve these problems. And I think for me, if we have a follow-up conversation and perhaps to think about in the future is what are the institutions that can kind of get us there? Because we talked about a council, and I think there's a lot of notions that how do we sort of get the political consensus and institutional momentum kind of all going in the same direction? And I think to me that's the $1 trillion question. And I would love to unpack this further. So to everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. Vass and Brett, you've both been fantastic, and we loved having you here. So we'll do it again. And as well, folks, you can, obviously please subscribe to Mooseworks if you haven't already subscribed. You can follow CCI on LinkedIn to keep up with the work we're doing. As well, frankly, if you guys want to just email me any thoughts about this session or stuff you'd like to see me cover on Mooseworks or, another Mooseworks Live, my email is my first letter of my first name and then my last name at canadianinnovators.org. Thank you, Patrick. Much more helpful than me trying to share that. Please do give me a ring. I'd be very happy to hear from you. And otherwise, Brett and Vass, are there places where people can find you if they want to read more of your work?
Easy to find me online at Columbia or on LinkedIn.
yeah, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, or you can hear random stuff on lately. It's not always related to productivity, I'm going to be honest.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. And until next time.
Thank you.